this lecture series. As always, I want to give thanks to Sawyier Public Library for hosting us, and to my co-organizer Diane Mahoney for everything she and her staff do in helping to put these lectures on for everyone. And many thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping these lectures and hosting them on their YouTube channel. I want to remind everyone that our fall season was unveiled last month, and you can find the schedule on the library's website as well as frankfortheritageweek.com, and there are flyers in the back as well. I also want to remind you that we have scheduled another pop-up lecture on August 27th at 6:00 p.m. on Kentucky's paleontology and fossil record, presented by Daniel J. Phelps, founder and president of the Kentucky Paleontological Society. I'm very excited for today's presentation, as it is part of a body of work that has been long overdue. As most of you know, I usually give a short intro of the lecture for context, but I'm going to let someone else do most of that today. Because I do want to acknowledge that this project partly arose from the work of our City Historic Preservation Officer, Vicki Berenberg, who, when she took on that job in 2021, said one of her first priorities for the city was having an African American historic context report completed. That report, a document of nearly around 350 pages, and there's a copy in the back, was completed in 2022 by the two consulting firms presenting for us today, and was the first in the state, and is considered a template for other communities in Kentucky, and led to the identification of several properties associated with our local Black community that deserve national recognition. So we greatly appreciate Vicki's work for Frankfort. And on a personal note, Vicki is one of a handful of people that I always have to acknowledge for showing me the ropes in the preservation world, and for providing me an invaluable education, an honest mentorship, and a warm friendship. Moreover, she's a wonderful person and a face that I'm always happy to see around town. Highly respected preservationist, most don't know how very lucky we are to have her in our community, much less the very important position she is in with the city. So it is certainly my honor to introduce her to you today. Vicki Berenberg is the city's Historic Preservation Officer since January 2021. During her tenure, the city has embarked on many new historic preservation initiatives, including the development of an African American Historic Context Report, a Historic Preservation Economic Impact Report, new design guidelines for the Special Capital Historic Zoning District, and the nomination of Green Hill Cemetery to the National Register of Historic Places. Prior to working for the city, Vicki spent over a decade working for the State Historic Preservation Office, where she developed the state's historic preservation plan called A Map Made of Memory. She has a master's degree in historic preservation from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and is also a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. She has been working in her field for over 24 years and found her way to her profession through the serial stewardship of various historic properties, including 3 in Kentucky, 2 in Illinois, and 1 in Wisconsin. Please welcome Frankfort's Historic Preservation Officer, Vicki Berenberg.
Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction, and those feelings are reciprocated. Thank you. And I want to thank you all for being here this evening. We appreciate your interest in this topic. I have a few thank yous I'd like to begin with, starting with the Sawyier Public Library, in particular, Diane Mahoney, as well as John, of course, as an organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series. In partnership, they have developed this fantastic framework for organizing events like this, and I am grateful for their assistance in making this program available to you. I'd also like to thank the members of the Green Hill Cemetery Board who provided their time and expertise to this project, including Jeanette Walker and Sheila Mason-Burton and Freddie Johnson. Both of who are here this evening. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Elizabeth McGrath, who has also contributed her time and expertise to recognizing the significance of the Green Hill community to Frankfort. Our city is rich with history, and it's rich with historic designations to the National Register of Historic Places. But like most places in the United States, Frankfort's designations associated with Black history and heritage are not represented well represented among the total. And we are taking active steps to address that disparity. As John mentioned, this began in 2021, and when the city began working with Carolyn Brackett of Cultural Heritage Works and Robbie Jones of Richard Grubb Associates to develop a historic context report that would summarize the historic Black experience in Frankfort and also identify resources associated with that history that would be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. This project was assisted by many partnering organizations, and funding was provided by the Kentucky Heritage Council Certified Local Government Program. The resulting 300-page plus document, which was published in 2022, has assisted in making that history more accessible to the community. And there, as John mentioned, there is a copy of that report on the back table there. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, you might want to take a look this evening. It's also available online on the city's website. In 2023, the city received another certified local government grant to complete a National Register nomination for the Green Hill Cemetery, which had been determined eligible for the National Register as part of that earlier project. The consultant chosen to carry out the project was again Richard Grubb Associates in Nashville, Tennessee, using the same team that completed the earlier African American Historic Context Report, along with Sidney Schoof of Richard Grubb Associates. The three of them have spent additional time in Frankfort gathering data and documenting the cemetery as part of their work on this project. Robbie, Sidney, and Carolyn together have about 75 years of combined experience documenting our nation's history and the built environment associated with that history, including those resources significant to the African American experience and civil rights movement. I could go on and speak for another 15 or 20 or 30 minutes just about the fascinating work they have completed all over the country. And there is additional bios for the three members of this outstanding team on the table in the back if you're interested. But I feel so fortunate to have access to their talent, and I hope that you enjoyed learning more about the cemetery and its role in Frankfort's history. So please join me in welcoming Robbie Jones, Sidney Schoof, and Carolyn Brackett back to Frankfort.
Thank you, Vicki. I want to echo what John Carlton said to begin with, that all the wonderful work that Vicki does. Carolyn Brackett and I believe that you're our favorite client, and we love working with you, and we would love to steal you and bring you back to Tennessee with us, but we'll let her stay. But as she had mentioned, Vicki mentioned earlier, this is the second project that Carolyn Brackett and I have worked on here in Frankfort, and the African American Historic Context project that we've completed in 2022 was definitely one of our favorite projects we've ever done. And we loved that project. And I was just driving in with Sidney. She wasn't on that project. She's on this one. And I was just showing her around town as we came in. I was like, oh, we did this, we did that. Look at this, look at that. So we love your town. We love the city. And we love coming back to visit and work here anytime you'll give us an opportunity. But as quickly, I'm the project manager for this particular project, but I'm going to let Sidney and Carolyn tell the story. So I'm just going to do introductory pleasantries kind of thing and then turn it over to them. So first of all, I want to mention that Richard Grubb Associates is, I want to let you know, we're a women-owned small business. We're headquartered in Cranberry, New Jersey. We have branches in Philadelphia, Raleigh, and Nashville. I run the Nashville office. But we are sensitive to resource types because we are a minority-owned firm. A male, obviously, but the vast majority of people I work with are female. All the people in my office are female except for myself. But so we sort of bring that sensitivity to all the projects that we do and look at things from a new lens, from a new angle, and sort of like try to think outside the box. So that being said, I also wanted to mention that some projects that we've done as a firm, or Carolyn is working on these projects, she and I have worked together for 25 years, going on 25 years. Sid and I worked together for going on 6 or 7 years, so we've worked together a very long time, and we know each other very well. But some projects we worked on that we're working on all types of projects throughout the country, but our favorites are the ones that are unique property types. And some of our favorites are African-American projects we worked on. Besides the context for Frankfort, we recently are wrapping up the Nashville Civil Rights Movement Multiple Property Documentation Project, which is for the whole city. And we nominated, Sydney led the way in nominating a church, a black church, which Clark Memorial, which is considered the cradle of the civil rights movement in Nashville, where that's going across the finish line right now. We're doing the North Carolina Green Book for the whole entire state, the multiple property nomination, and we're going to nominate one of the Green Book properties in Greensboro, North Carolina. That one's just getting kicked off. I've also did work on a team that did the Tennessee statewide survey of all the Green Book resources, and that's getting ready to be published online by the University of Virginia Press. We worked on the Birmingham Civil Rights National Historic Landmark Project a few years ago, and that was a very precedent-setting project because we started looking at march routes as a resource types, and the marches in Birmingham. We applied that information and experience to here in Frankfort for your own march route along Capitol Boulevard, Freedom March. And a couple of others. We did a lot of projects in Maryland. African-American resources we're documenting. We're actually working on one right now, a tenant house in Maryland, but they come to us because we've got this experience on how to evaluate these properties. And the last one I mentioned, we just got a contract in Nashville to do mid-20th century African-American historic districts, neighborhoods, and we're going to kick that project off in the next month. And that also applies because we did some African-American mid-20th century neighborhoods here in Frankfort. College Hill over at Kentucky State University is one of my favorites. So anyways, all that being said, just want to give you a background on who we are as a group. Carolyn Brackett runs her own firm. She's an independent. She's a principal of her own firm, Cultural Heritage Works. We work in combination a lot on projects. And so the historic context she led, that was her project, and I assisted. This one we led and she's assisting. But we work together in whatever way works best for us on all of our projects. She's been doing this for a while, and I'll let her tell the story, but we love working with Carolyn. And I just want to make it clear that she's not working for Richard Grubb Associates as an employee. She has her own firm. So if you want to talk to her about projects, go talk to Carolyn. Sydney and I, she's a senior architectural historian. She's worked for me for a while now. And she led the technical component of this nomination. She's the one who put together all the technical parts. National Register nominations are tricky. It's not just saying this place is important. We all know that. It's how to get it listed on the National Register, whatever its boundaries, period of significance, contributing, non-contributing resources, and all these who owns it and legal stuff and technical, legal, law sort of things. And Sydney navigated us through that process. And Carolyn did all the research, and she's a great storyteller, so she is going to help tell the story. At the end of their presentation, we'll have a few minutes left over, a lot of minutes, however many minutes you want, to have questions and answers section. So please be thinking about questions. We want you to ask questions. We want to have a conversation at the end and not just be like, we're done, let's leave. So be thinking about that. With that, I'll turn it over to Carolyn, who is going to speak first. And you come to this side because there's a word over there.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening. We're on Eastern time here, so I have to think about that. So I'm adding up all these decades that y'all are talking about, and they really add up. But Robbie is correct. This has got to be one of the high points working on the African American historic context study a couple of years ago. Is definitely a high point for me as well. And I was so excited however many months ago when the email popped up from Vicki with the RFP to do this nomination. Immediately sent it to Robbie. He's like, we got to do this. So we're very excited to be here. As Robbie said, my interest is connecting place and story. And so when I had the opportunity to do the research and delve in more into what is the story, we got some of that working on the context study, but to have the opportunity to delve even more deeply was a really exciting opportunity. And I want to be sure to thank the people who go before us and continue to do that research, because so much of that was foundational to this nomination, and we want to be sure to acknowledge that. What I want to do in the next few minutes is just to share first some information on why a National Register nomination and a listing in the National Register is important. What does that mean? And then to share with you some of the story that is included in the nomination. And then there is a copy of the nomination. I believe it's online and available. We can make that available to anybody who'd like to read the whole thing. So tonight we'll only have time to hit some of the high points. Make sure I got this. I may need a little help with this advance. Let me see. I may need a little help with this. I'm not sure. It was working. It was working a minute ago. Maybe I'm just.
Okay. Here you go.
Huh?
Yeah.
Okay, so just forward.
Yeah, just forward.
Okay. You have to turn it on. That's what makes it work. So, okay, highly technical, highly technical. I wanted to just start by explaining what is the National Register of Historic Places. It is the nation's list of places that are considered worthy of preservation. It goes back to 1966 when the National Historic Preservation Act was passed. I looked up and updated. I have 95,000 places. Most recently, that's up to 96, and about 1.8 million individual resources. But of those, only about 4% are listed specifically for African American history. So Frankfort is really leading the way and setting a good example for other communities to follow in trying to increase that number, because 4% is not nearly enough. The National Register is important for a number of reasons, and we included here some of the more of the technical reasons. In some cases, properties are eligible for tax credits, grants, easements, those types of things. If there's a federal, any kind of federal involvement, then a National Register listed property. There has to be some kind of evaluation and mitigation. For me, one of the most important things, which I think I should have put on this slide, is the story. I refer to National Register nominations all the time if I'm doing research for a project. I immediately go to try to find the nomination. Now, we'll say some of those that go way back to the beginning are not very detailed, and that's another issue. There need to be some updates, but the National Register documents can serve, to me, they're really not only a document that lists a place, but they're a document that says something about how a community feels about its historic resources. So it makes a statement to the community and to outsiders as well. In Frankfort, there are 4 sites currently that are listed in the National Register. The church, the Green Hill Church, was just listed this year, so that was very exciting. And then 2 places at Kentucky State, and then of course the Colored Soldiers Monument at the cemetery, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Throughout the city, there are a number of sites of all different types that are listed in the National Register, including homes, there are archaeological sites, historic districts that have multiple properties throughout the districts, the Frankfort Cemetery, and then, of course, the state capitol. There are also 3 National Historic Landmarks, which is the highest level of designation, Liberty Hall, the Old State House, and the George Stagg Distillery. So you have good representation throughout the city listed in the National Register. We've mentioned the African American Historic Context Report that we completed in 2022, and this slide takes the language straight out of the original description of the intent of the Historic Context Report, that it was to serve a number of purposes, to provide a preservation planning tool, to honor the history and heritage, to connect place and story, as we just talked about, and to provide a framework for listing places in the National Register. So we're definitely checking that box this evening. In the study, and Robbie did the research on this and created the database, and if you want to take a look at the report in the back of the room, you can see more about that, but identified a number of sites throughout the city that are now recognized as eligible for listing in the National Register. And as we said, the church has already been listed, the cemetery is coming up next, and then hopefully some of these other properties will have an opportunity to be listed as well. So that gives a little bit of background on the National Register, why it's important, and how we got to where we are tonight. But what I want to do now is kind of shift over to the cemetery itself and share with you some of the stories that came out of the research process and preparation of the National Register nomination. And I wanted to just look in these 5 areas. As I said, when I was telling John, when I start doing this research and reading old newspaper articles, you can just go down the rabbit hole and spend lots and lots of time just being absorbed with the things that you find. But the important thing is to be able to bring those back and summarize them and communicate them in the nomination. And so that's what we've tried to do. So I want to talk about 5 areas that the nomination addresses. The growth of the Green Hill community itself, the city and the county, and their establishment of the cemetery as a place for paupers to be buried, the Civil War and the process of commemoration. I also looked into funeral services and traditions and found lots of interesting information about that time, the late 18 into the early mid-1900s time period, and then the cemetery itself, its ownership and its management. So the Green Hill community, as everyone here probably already knows, was founded following the Civil War. Land was set aside, most likely by a man named Alexander Walker Macklin Sr. or his son-in-law, Stephen Black, to sell to formerly enslaved African Americans following the Civil War. Prior to the war, Macklin had enslaved about as many as 120 people, and it's likely that these are the folks, or some of those are the people who founded Green Hill. And then as the community grew, of course, a school, a church, and then eventually the cemetery. From its earliest days, Frankfort city government paid the burial costs of poor and indigent residents in the old Frankfort cemetery. But in 1865, the city and the county government joined together to establish a pauper cemetery on the outside of town. They purchased the land from a man named Peter Dudley. They paid $200 for it. And the deed describes the land and the purchase. Dudley was a leading citizen of Frankfort. He had served in the War of 1812. But prior to the Civil War, he had also enslaved as many as 16 people. The cemetery was the 3rd cemetery in Frankfort, as I'm sure you know, the old Frankfort Cemetery and then the Frankfort Cemetery. But up until the 20th century, I was really interested in this because we're looking at it for connections to African American history, but most of the references to it by government were as a pauper cemetery. So the cemetery, the city and county had a cemetery. They also had an almshouse or a poorhouse, and the city provided support to people who were on what they called the pauper list. I found quite a few notices in the newspaper articles reporting on city council where people would come and ask for assistance from the city, and these are a few of the news articles. One of these is from 1893, and it said Henry Penn of color had appeared before the council and asked to be placed on the pauper list for $3 a month, and his prayer was granted. So there were a number of those types of requests, but I also found letters to the newspaper of people complaining about that, and found one where someone was complaining that the city had spent $435 on coffins that year, and they were not happy about that. The cemetery always continued to be a burial place for the indigent, but very soon African Americans who lived in Green Hills and in Frankfort began to be buried there, eventually becoming a predominantly black cemetery, although white people were buried there as well. The Colored Soldiers Monument is a centerpiece of the cemetery, and it was the high point of the Kentucky U.S. Colored Troops convening in 1924, July 4th, 1924, and it just occurred to me we're almost 100 years next week, so I hope y'all are going to go out there and stand around the monument. The 10-foot tall stone colored soldiers monument was unveiled. The newspaper, the State Journal, reported that it was erected at a cost of several $100s under the direction of the Colored Women's Relief Corps. There were lots of accounts of annual events at the cemetery for many, many years. I think as long as there were veterans from the Civil War, from the colored troops, every year they would have Decoration Day focused on decorating the graves of the soldiers. One thing I found that I thought was really interesting was you had the Monroe Post, which was the African American veterans group, and then the white veterans group, Albert Bacon Post, had ceremonies in 1887 at the Frankfort Cemetery, but the newspaper report noted that when that commemoration at that cemetery was over, the colored troops moved to Green Hills Cemetery on their own. The white veterans group did not come with them, and I thought that was sad, but interesting. This monument is one of only 16 in the country that are dedicated to African American troops from the Civil War, and this monument was listed individually in the National Register in 1997. An additional thing, a story I ran across that I had to include in here because I think is so telling. As I said, I want to tell the story, and to me, these two things side by side say a whole lot. Just a month before the Colored Soldiers Monument was dedicated, there was a huge gathering now I have to find the name of it, to dedicate a monument to Jefferson Davis. And the governor was there. It was on June the 7th, 1924, only a few weeks before. A 351-foot tall monument, Fairview, sorry, I had to look up the name, one of more than 60 memorials placed across the state from the end of the Civil War through the 1930s. So this is all occurring at the height of the Jim Crow era, at the low point of race relations, and so this huge crowd, lots of front page newspaper articles, and the governor told the crowd, he had this long statement, so I'll only share one sentence. He told the crowd over 1,000 monuments have been raised in our Southland to honor the memory of her heroes, and these will portray to future generations the love and reverence with which the ideals and principles of her fallen veterans have been cherished by the sons and daughters of the Confederacy. Thought that was really interesting since Kentucky did not secede, was not a Confederate state. Also, I found that the state contributed $15,000 toward the cost of this monument, which cost $200,000. The Colored Soldiers Monument, the funds were raised privately. So that time period that we're looking at 100 years ago, I think this story to me says a lot about that time period. Another area that we looked at related to the cemetery was the practice of funeral services and traditions. The cemetery's establishment, its growth, the events, the burials that were held there, the commemorations, the decoration days, really reflect a lot about, from the mid-19th century on, of funeral services and traditions. Now, prior to the Civil War, of course, most funerals were managed by family members. They prepared their deceased loved one for burial. Caskets were made by local carpenters or cabinet makers. There were at least 3 hardware businesses and 2 cabinet and hearse makers in Frankfort who advertised their services. During the Civil War, embalming techniques were introduced to allow soldiers who had been killed in battle to be transported long distances home for burial. And after the Civil War, embalming became used by the general population. And at that time, funerals began to be moved to churches, to commercial establishments that became known as funeral homes. In Cincinnati, the first school dedicated to mortuary services was the Cincinnati College of Embalming, which opened in 1882, and this became very important because Jackson Robb, who we'll talk about in a minute, attended that school, graduated from that school. In 1904, the Kentucky General Assembly formed the Kentucky State Board of Embalming with the focus of, as they said, quote, to provide for better protection of life and health and to prevent the spread of contagious diseases. 10 years later, in 1914, they required that all undertakers, they call it, must be licensed. They must be at least 21 years of age and have basically apprenticed to an undertaker and be of good moral character. Also, an important part of funeral services and traditions were the obituaries that were printed in the newspapers. And up until probably the early to mid 20th century, they were very condescending to African Americans, often referring to them as aunt or uncle. Well-known, upright and honorable appeared quite a bit. One of a woman named Lucy Dodson, who they note was born a slave and was faithful in her service to the family. So we see lots of those. By the mid-20th century, they had stopped identifying people as colored in obituaries, but you knew who it was if the Thomas K. Robb Funeral Home was handling the arrangements. In Kentucky, the Jim Crow laws didn't specifically address mortuary services, but it was definitely a custom. The funeral homes provided a place to hold dignified services. Funeral home directors became respected pillars of the community. In Frankfort, it was the Thomas K. Robb Funeral Home, the city's only black-owned funeral home from the late 19th century to the mid-20th century. It was founded by Thomas Robb and his wife Mary, and later their son Jackson. When Thomas Robb died in 1932, Jackson, or Jack Robb, became the director. He was only 22, so he just barely met the state's requirement age to take over the funeral home. And then, as I said, he also graduated from the Cincinnati College of Embalming. So he continued to operate the funeral home for more than 3 decades until 1965, when he announced that his physician had told him he had to step back. And then 3 years later, Mary Robb posted a newspaper announcement selling all the furnishings from the funeral home. Jack Robb, of course, would be a leader in the organization to manage the cemetery when the city and the county divest themselves of it. So, and then the last area is looking at city ownership and management. I found, the first reference I found in looking at lots and lots of newspaper articles was in November of 1900, when they referred to it as Green Hill Cemetery. Now, there were some other references by others before that, but in like city council notes and that kind of thing. That was the first reference I found where they specifically said Green Hill Cemetery. Before that, it was referred to as the Pauper Cemetery. That was the interest that the governments had in it, the city and county. I couldn't find a record of who was the first official caretaker, but we do know there were 9 between 1900 and 1957. From the descriptions in city council minutes and government records, it appears that was an administrative position because those reports talk about budget, oversight, collecting fees, opening and closing graves, maintenance of the cemetery. Every now and then you'd see notices like this or reports like this one in 1934 where the mayor says it's being run haphazardly and we need to get a plan, and then you don't necessarily see anything after that. The person who was the longest tenured caretaker was a man named Ambrose Polsgrove. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was there for 26 years, from 1910 to 1936. He was a white man. He had descended from settlers who came here in the early 19th century and established a small community of Polsgrove. His father was a lock keeper for riverboats traveling the Kentucky River. The first woman to assume the job was Pearl Stafford in 1939. She was a white woman. She had come here to teach school. She held the job for 12 years, got paid $120 a year. In her very first report to the city council, she asked for an increase in the fee for opening and closing the graves from $5 to $7. There were a couple more caretakers, and then in 1954, a man named Charles Hodge was appointed. He only stayed 3 years. And he submitted his resignation, and he said the reason was the proposed sale of land, the cemetery land, and his, as it said, inability to get assurance from the city or county officials that a caretaker would be continued. And he was right. The city and the county at that point were ready to, as I said, get out of the cemetery business, and Jackson Robb's leadership became critical to the future of the cemetery. So in 1957, the county fiscal court issued a resolution expressing their worry over the poor condition of the Green Hills Cemetery, now without a sexton since June. This was in September. So they officially hired Jack Robb and noted he had been doing the job already since June, so they backdated his salary of $20 a month, and that really marked the first step toward a major transition as the city and the county announced their intention to get out of the cemetery business. So after that, it was a little complicated trying to unscramble what happened because the government's tried several different things. The first was to sell some of the land to raise money to build a new health department. So they took bids in July of 1957. They got a high bid of $26,000, but they didn't close the sale. Their next step was to say, we're going to build the health department on the cemetery property. At that point, the state stepped in and said, no, you aren't, because it was too far from town. So that plan went nowhere. So they went back to their original plan of selling property to fund the health department's construction. So they posted this newspaper announcement, which we were thrilled to find because it shows us exactly how they had divided up the property. They announced they were going to sell it at auction in 3 tracts to be sold separately. The ad, you can't see at the bottom, but it invites Mr. Businessman or Mr. Investor to inspect this US 60 property. So that auction went through. It brought $30,500 for 3 tracts. $25,000 was earmarked for the health department building. Sun Oil Company bought 2 of the tracts. A man named Melvin Carter, a local realtor, bought 1. And then, of course, as we know, the service station was constructed, a grocery store, and the city and county agreed to divide the remaining $5,500. They didn't allocate any for the cemetery. Instead, they said there was $491 left in the account for the cemetery, and that could go to beautify it. So at this point, Jack Robb had either been told or anticipated that this was going to happen, and he began working to make plans to form a new nonprofit to take it over. And newspaper articles started popping up, that this is going to happen. At that point, the city manager said the city might be willing to transfer the land to the new organization, but they would not give any of the excess funds to the group from the sale of the property. At the end of 1958, both the city and the county agreed to transfer the land, and they made a big announcement of a new corporation known as Green Hill Cemetery, a nonprofit, and the stipulation was that they continued to provide a place for pauper burials. The deeds were transferring ownership happened. The county filed them on October 31st, 1958, followed by the city on December 22nd. So the new cemetery immediately faced the new management group immediately faced financial challenges. The city did relent, and the county and contributed $4,000 and the agreement to the funding that paid for pauper burials. A lot of the funds this first years went for cleaning up the cemetery, buying groundskeeping tools, and building Atwood Avenue. At this point, Jack Robb engaged Marguerite Chanty, asked her to help with management of the cemetery, and she convinced the mayor to allocate $1,500 toward its upkeep, and funds were allocated from the county to construct a new equipment shed, which her husband Frank constructed. But by 1960, the financial situation was severe, and within the next few years, you see constant announcements of fundraising campaigns. You see pictures in the newspaper showing where overgrown grass or the retaining wall needing to be repaired. In 1961, there was another fundraising campaign for $2,500, aiming for that much. The county court gave $450 from the remaining funds from the land sale. So it was this kind of trying to cobble together the funds necessary to maintain the cemetery, and that continued for many years. In 1990, Marguerite Chanty wrote a letter to the newspaper, and as she pointed out, it's an asset to the city and the county and deserves everyone's support. In 2020, the agreement was reached to provide $10,000 a year to help maintain the cemetery. And today there are more than 3,700 burials in the cemetery. It continues to be a center of the community. And at this point, I will turn it over to Sydney, and then we'll have time for some discussion after Sydney's presentation.
Thank you, Carolyn. So Carolyn's done a great job telling us all about the wonderful and fascinating things that have happened here, but that doesn't necessarily mean it automatically gets listed in the National Register of Historic Places, which is our nation's list, as she said, of places that are worthy of preservation. So in order to be on that list, it's not just an essay saying pretty please. It's a more formal, it's a form. And so there's a lot of stuff that you have to fill out and identify so that you can prove to the federal government that this is a significant place and it is worthy of preservation. There are a number of types of history that we can choose from to list something on the National Register of Historic Places. And it kind of tells us what type of history happened. So the first one is Criterion A, which means the place is associated with events and the broad patterns of history, which is what we have here. The other options are Criterion B, which means it's associated with the life of a significant person. Criterion C, which means it embodies, significant architectural or design elements. Or criterion D, which means it's likely to yield information about history or prehistory, which is generally archaeology. And then we also have to discuss a period of significance. When did these significance events happen at this place? In general, a place must be at least 50 years old to be considered old enough to be historic. So for our period of significance, we chose 1865, which is when the burials began at the Green Hill Cemetery, up to 50 years ago, which is 1974. And then we can also note significant dates at a place that contribute to its history. And so we have the construction of the Colored Soldiers Monument and the transfer of ownership to the Green Hills Cemetery Incorporated. And then we've got a brief bulleted list of some of the ways in which this place contributes to the broad patterns of history, discussing integration in cemeteries and the construction as a pauper cemetery, the Green Hill community, and a whole host of events that happened at this place and ideas that formed. So in order to be listed on the National Register, it has to still look and feel like it did during its period of significance. In general, we try to think about if someone from that period of significance came here, could they still recognize it? And if too much has changed, we might say it's more likely, like a historic marker would be more appropriate for that place. And part of how we evaluate that is how many changes have been made. Some changes are totally fine. And so at this place, we've got a list of the contributing elements, which are elements that tell us about the history of the place. So were built during the period of significance, and then elements that are newer. And do these newer elements overshadow our historic place? And we believe no. And I think you'll agree. So there have been several changes that have been made at the Green Hill Cemetery during our period of significance. And those are part of the story that Carolyn has told. So you can see our tiny little cemetery up in the corner at Green Hill. And then in 1952, how much bigger it's gotten. And I've got an arrow pointed to the original entrance off of Main Street. And then some more illustrations about some of the changes that happened. The first sale of the land to the Winn-Dixie, and so we still have an entrance near Main Street. And then in 1959, that last sale of land, they moved it around. You can kind of see in that area our brand new shed at the new entrance, showing some of these histories that tell us the story of this place. So being listed in the National Register is not just about all the pretty little things that exist. Just because it's beautiful doesn't mean that it is historic, or vice versa. So here we're at the outside of the cemetery, and we've got the 1958 retaining wall built just after this portion of the cemetery was sold for our lovely gas station. And it's just a concrete retaining wall, but that is a historic part of the cemetery showing how things have changed. Now, this retaining wall in the front on Main Street was replaced in 2024, and it kind of looks like the stone originally, but that was originally there, but not quite. And so because that's newer, that is not necessarily one of our contributing elements to the cemetery. Similarly, we have our 1958 historic tool shed that was designed by Frank Shanti, who's a professor at KSU, and built by Black stonemasons and community members, the John Henry Guy Jr., William C. Jacobs Sr., and William Jack Gaines. And then we also have these really nice gate posts and fence with the lovely GH, but those were built in the 1990s, and so are not some of our contributing elements to the cemetery. But once we get into the cemetery, we've got a better feel of what is happening there and its history. You saw from those aerial photographs that it's not a formally planned, pre-laid out cemetery. This was a pauper cemetery, and so it's not organized in chronological order as you might expect from other cemeteries built later. So we've got most of our older burials in the northwest corner, the first portion of the cemetery, and then as you move farther away from that corner, there are newer burials, but there are also newer burials mixed in with some of the much older burials. We've got a number of different headstones. You can see they're relatively simple. Limestone and marble tablets with flat or arched tops. But more importantly, I think the things you can tell about the community from these headstones, there are a number of veterans' headstones that you can see, including Civil War veterans and veterans from World War I and World War II throughout. And then there are also headstones with the logos of like the Masons and the Independent Order of Odd Fellows and other fraternal organizations. And last, and certainly not least, we have the Colored Soldiers Monument up in the northwest corner. As Carolyn told us all about, it's built in 1924 and listed individually in the National Register of Historic Places in 1997. In 1997, they're also, so sorry. Well, in 1997, they also added the new flagpole and the walkway and the benches and everything else to help us all enjoy the lovely Colored Soldiers Monument up there. And then that's my walkthrough. And does anybody have any questions?
Yes, thank you all. I need to wrap it up for table 10, but you all are welcome to stay and talk. Thank you all for everything. Sydney, Robbie, Carolyn. Said, if you all would like to donate to their cause, please reach out to them for the incredible work that they're doing. On the same note, since we're talking about archaeology too, I want to let you know that our next lecture is Dr. Gwen Henderson with the Kentucky Archaeological Survey. She's the Director of Education. She will be doing part 2, Kentucky's Ancient American Indian History as told through Franklin County's archaeology on July 13th at 1 o'clock, Saturday. So please come out for that, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thanks, John.